My name is Grace Hollow. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside systems that run quietly. Corporate teams, long projects, processes that only get noticed when something breaks. I've never been the loudest voice in the room. I've never been the one who dominates meetings or claims space with bravado. People often describe me as steady, reliable, or easy to work with. What they usually mean is that I don't demand attention. For a long time, I believed that was a strength. I believed that consistency would be seen, that contribution would speak for itself, and that professionalism would be reciprocated. I was wrong about some of that, but not in the way people expect when they hear a story like this. This isn't a revenge story. It's not a dramatic expose, and it's not about humiliating anyone. There are no villains twirling, no explosive confrontations, no sudden triumphs. What I'm going to share is quieter than that. It's about what happens when courtesy disappears from a process that claims to value people. It's about what shifts internally when you realize you've been making yourself small in the name of harmony. And it's about what happens when silence stops being fear and starts being choice. At one point in this story, I found out I'd been removed from the team through the company newsletter. There was no meeting, no conversation, no warning. Courtesy wasn't part of the process. That sentence may sound simple, but it carries a weight that took me a long time to fully understand. Not because it hurt my pride, but because it clarified something I had been avoiding for years. Over the next hour or so, I'll walk you through the emotional landscape of what that realization set in motion. You'll hear how I was perceived, how small dismissals accumulated, and how I learned to recognize patterns instead of excusing them. You'll hear about the moment something shifted, not outwardly, but internally, and how that quiet shift changed every decision that followed. I won't exaggerate details, and I won't pretend I was perfect. I stayed silent longer than I should have. I rationalized behavior that didn't deserve defending. And I benefited, in small ways, from the same system that eventually made me invisible. This story is about accountability as much as it is about awareness. If you're listening because you've ever felt overlooked, or because you've been told you're lucky just to be included, I want you to know this isn't about encouraging bitterness. It's about clarity. It's about understanding the difference between patience and self-erasure, between loyalty and self-betrayal. So before we begin, I want to ask you something gently, without expectation. Have you ever realized too late that you were playing a role someone else assigned to you without ever agreeing to it? Before anything was taken from me, before titles shifted and my name quietly disappeared from documents, I needed to explain who I was to them, or more precisely, how I existed in their awareness. I was the person who made things work, not the visionary, not the closer, not the one whose ideas were quoted in meetings. I was the one who remembered, the one who noticed when something didn't line up, the one who stayed late, not because anyone asked, but because loose ends bothered me. If a process ran smoothly, my presence vanished inside it. If something failed, I was suddenly visible. People didn't underestimate my intelligence. That would have been easier. Instead, they underestimated my importance. There's a difference. One is loud, the other is silent and corrosive. In meetings, I was often introduced last, if at all. Grace handles operations, someone would say, as if operations were a natural phenomenon rather than a daily series of decisions. When discussions grew tense, eyes didn't turn to me for opinion, but they did turn to me for confirmation. Grace, can you make that work? Not, should we? Just, can you? And I always could. That became my defining trait: capability without friction. I didn't challenge timelines publicly. I didn't push back emotionally. If something was unrealistic, I found a way to make it less disastrous. I translated ambition into execution, quietly absorbing the cost. Over time, this positioned me in a very specific place: indispensable, but not central. There's a kind of invisibility that comes from being too reliable. When you're consistent, people stop checking in. When you don't complain, people stop asking how you're doing. When you adapt quickly, people forget that adaptation has a price. I wasn't excluded from the team. That's important. I was included just enough to keep functioning, just enough to stay informed, just enough to keep delivering. I was copied on emails after decisions were made. I was invited to meetings where outcomes were already agreed upon. My role was to implement, not to influence. And I accepted that, at first, because I told myself a story. I told myself that contribution mattered more than credit. That impact didn't need applause. Mature professionals didn't need constant validation. I told myself that staying calm was strength, that not reacting was wisdom. And some of that was true. But some of it was fear dressed up as professionalism. I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to be the person who slowed momentum. I didn't want to risk being seen as emotional or territorial. So I made myself smaller in ways that felt responsible at the time. I softened my language. I deferred credit. I let others speak over me without interrupting, trusting that substance would eventually surface. What I didn't realize was that perception calcifies faster than reality. Once people see you as support, they stop imagining you as leadership. Once they see you as steady, they stop checking if you're stretched thin. Once you're useful without being visible, you become easy to rearrange. I didn't feel mistreated, not overtly. There were no insults, no public humiliations, just a gradual narrowing of space. A quiet assumption that I would adjust, accommodate, and absorb. And because I always had, no one questioned whether I should. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly. At the time, it felt like professionalism. It felt like being part of a team. It felt like trust. But trust, when it only flows in one direction, it starts to look a lot like entitlement. I was the person they relied on without consulting. The person whose absence would cause chaos, but whose presence was rarely acknowledged. I existed in the margins of their awareness, not because I lacked value, but because I didn't demand visibility. And that's the role I was playing when the first small cut came. I didn't know it then. But everything that followed made sense once I understood who I had allowed myself to be to them. The first moment of disrespect didn't arrive with drama. There was no raised voice, no sharp email, no obvious line crossed. That's why it stayed with me. Because part of me sensed it mattered, and another part worked very hard to convince me it didn't. It happened during a routine planning cycle, one of those quarterly transitions where responsibilities subtly shift under the language of optimization. I had spent weeks preparing documentation, timelines, dependencies, risk assessments. Not because I was asked to, but because I knew the handoff would fail without it. I sent everything ahead of time, clearly labeled, clearly explained. The meeting itself was short, efficient, polite. Halfway through, someone referenced a process I had designed. They described it as if it had emerged organically. "We've been doing it this way," they said, gesturing vaguely. No name, no acknowledgement. I waited for a correction. From them, from anyone. It didn't come. Instead, the conversation moved on. That was the cut. Small, clean, almost elegant. I remember the physical sensation more than the thought. A brief tightening in my chest, a pause in my breathing, the instinct to speak, and the immediate decision not to. I told myself it wasn't worth interrupting the flow. That credit wasn't important, that this was collaborative work. Everyone else ignored it, or maybe they genuinely didn't notice. That's the thing about subtle disrespect. It blends seamlessly into normalcy. There's no alarm, no record, just a moment that quietly redefines what's acceptable. After the meeting, a colleague stopped by my desk. That went smoothly, they said. Thanks for pulling everything together. It was said kindly, casually, as if what I'd noticed hadn't happened at all. I smiled. I said, of course. That response became a template. Over the next few weeks, I replayed that moment more than I wanted to admit. Not obsessively, just enough to keep it alive. I wondered if I was being too sensitive, if I were projecting meaning onto something neutral, if expecting acknowledgement was a sign of ego I didn't want to cultivate. So I did what I'd always done. I rationalized. I told myself that leadership had a lot on its plates, that they weren't intentionally erasing contributions, that the work mattered more than who did it. I reminded myself that I had stability, respect, and a seat at the table, even if it wasn't the head of it. But something shifted in how I listened after that. I started noticing patterns instead of incidents. How ideas I raised in one-on-one conversations resurfaced in group settings without attribution. How decisions affecting my workload were made without my input. How we slowly started meaning them, while I remained functionally responsible but strategically peripheral. Still, I said nothing. Silence has a way of training people. When you don't object, others assume consent. When you don't claim space, it gets repurposed. And when you consistently absorb minor slights without reaction, the system learns that it can proceed without adjusting for you. I wasn't angry. That's important. I wasn't hurt in a dramatic sense. I was unsettled, as if a hairline fracture had formed beneath something I'd assumed was solid. The most unsettling part wasn't what they did. It was how quickly I adapted to it. I began double-checking myself before speaking, softening language even further, adding qualifiers to ideas that didn't need them. I became more efficient, not less, more careful, more anticipatory, as if excellence could compensate for invisibility. No one asked me to do this. No one instructed me to shrink. But the environment rewarded it. The smoother things ran, the less visible I became. The less visible I became, the easier it was to overlook me. That first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar immediately. But it marked the beginning of a pattern where my presence was optional. My labor was assumed, and my voice was increasingly decorative. I didn't confront it. I didn't name it. I filed it away as something to be professional about. What I didn't understand then was that professionalism, when unbalanced, can become a form of self-erasure. And once that becomes normal, it's very hard to notice when the next cut is deeper. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It arrives in increments so small that each one feels survivable on its own. By the time you realize there's a pattern, you've already adapted to it. After that first small cut, nothing changed on the surface. My title stayed the same. My workload increased in ways that were framed as opportunities. My calendar was filled with meetings where my presence was necessary, but my input was optional. And because nothing was explicitly wrong, I continued behaving as if everything was fine. That's how normalization begins. I started receiving requests after decisions had already been made. We've already committed to this, someone would say, sliding a new responsibility into my queue. There was no discussion of feasibility, no invitation to challenge assumptions, just an expectation that I would figure it out, as I always had. When I did speak up, it was often met with a kind of polite dismissal, not disagreement, just redirection. Let's circle back, or we'll take that offline, or my personal favorite. That's a good point, but for now, the sentence always ended before anything actually changed. I told myself this was normal, that this was how organizations worked, that influence came with time, that pushing too hard would mark me as inflexible. So I adjusted again. I refined my tone. I learned when to speak and when silence would be more efficient. I stopped volunteering ideas in group settings and instead shared them privately with people who had louder voices. Watching those ideas resurface later, reframed and represented, became something I trained myself not to react to. This wasn't martyrdom, it was a strategy, or at least that's what I called it at the time. But strategy implies intention. What I was really doing was adapting to avoid friction. And every adaptation taught the system that I would bend before it had to. There were moments, small, sharp ones, when the imbalance became briefly visible. A meeting scheduled during a time I'd clearly blocked off. A deliverable was reassigned without notification. A conversation about streamlining that somehow excluded the person doing the streamlining. Each time I paused. Each time I considered speaking up. And each time I decided it wasn't worth it. Not because I didn't care, but because caring felt risky. I'd seen what happened to people who challenged too directly. They were labeled intense, difficult, or not a culture fit. I told myself I was being smart, that I was choosing stability, that I could influence quietly from within. But influence without acknowledgement is a fragile thing. It depends entirely on others remembering your value. And memory fades quickly when convenience is at stake. What surprised me most was how easily I internalized the imbalance. I began to question my own expectations. Was it unreasonable to want to be consulted? Was it ego to want recognition? Was I confusing collaboration with control? These questions kept me compliant. The truth was simpler, but harder to face. I had made myself easy to overlook. Not invisible, but ignorable. I didn't push back when my scope expanded without discussion. I didn't object when my role was summarized inaccurately in cross-team conversations. I corrected quietly, one-on-one, trusting that clarity would propagate. It rarely did. And slowly, my silence was reinterpreted as agreement. The environment didn't become hostile. It became efficient. Efficient at extracting my labor without adjusting its behavior. Efficient at relying on my competence while bypassing my autonomy. Efficient at treating my presence as a given. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being essential but unconsulted. You're included just enough to be responsible, but not enough to be respected. And because there's no single moment you can point to and say, this is wrong, you start to doubt your own perception. I remember thinking more than once, maybe this is just how things are when you're not trying to be a leader. As if leadership were a personality trait, rather than a position of influence that can be claimed or denied. What I didn't realize was that by normalizing these small dismissals, I was participating in my own marginalization. Not intentionally, not willingly, but consistently. I stayed because I believed endurance would be rewarded, that loyalty would be noticed, that if I just kept delivering, someone would eventually say, we need grace at the table. That moment never came. Instead, the role I was playing became fixed. And once a role is fixed, the system starts to depend on it. while quietly preparing to replace it. I didn't know that yet. I was still telling myself that silence was patience, that adaptability was strength, and that speaking up could wait. But the longer you wait to name disrespect, the more normal it becomes, not just to others, but to you. And that normalization set the stage for the role I was about to fully understand. At some point, without a meeting or a memo, I realized I had been assigned a role I never consciously accepted. It wasn't written anywhere. It didn't come with a title change, but it was clear in how people interacted with me, what they expected, and more importantly, what they didn't. I was the reliable one, not the kind of reliability that earns authority, but the kind that absorbs pressure, the one who fills gaps without being asked, the one who makes other people's decisions look smarter by smoothing over their consequences. I was useful in a very specific, very contained way. They didn't come to me for vision. They came to me for execution. They didn't ask what I thought should happen. They asked how fast I could make what they'd already decided happen. And when something went wrong, they didn't question the decision. They looked to me to fix it. This role came with an unspoken expectation: emotional neutrality. I wasn't supposed to be frustrated. I wasn't supposed to push back too hard. I wasn't supposed to need context or credit. My value was in my steadiness, not my perspective. As long as I remained calm and capable, everything functioned. And to be fair, I was good at it. I knew the systems better than anyone. I understood where the bottlenecks were, which shortcuts were safe, and which risks were real. I could anticipate problems before they surfaced. That knowledge gave me quiet confidence, but it also made me harder to replace, which I mistook for security. What I didn't see was how narrowly I was being defined. In conversations about growth, my name didn't come up. Not because I lacked potential, but because my role was too convenient to disrupt. Promoting me would mean losing the person who made everything else easier. Including me in strategic discussions would mean acknowledging that I had been excluded from them before. So instead, I was praised for being dependable, for being low drama, for always having it handled. Those compliments felt good at first. They sounded like respect, but over time, they began to feel like boundaries. I noticed how new hires were introduced to me. Grace will help you get oriented. Not Grace leads this area. I noticed how my work was summarized upward, compressed, simplified, detached from the decisions behind it. I noticed how often I was thanked privately and overlooked publicly. Still, I stayed within the role. Part of me believed that stepping outside it would create unnecessary conflict. Another part worried that if I pushed too hard, I'd expose how much of my identity had become tied to being the reliable one. Who was I if I wasn't the person everyone leaned on? There's a safety in being needed, even when it's limiting. So I kept doing what I did best. I kept things running. I kept my tone even. I kept my questions careful. I told myself that influence could be built quietly, that timing mattered, that patience was a virtue. But patience, when it's one-sided, starts to look like permission. The role I was assigned didn't require my full presence, just my output. It didn't ask for my opinion, just my compliance. And because I delivered without complaint, there was no incentive for anyone to reconsider the arrangement. I wasn't being mistreated in obvious ways. That's what made it so difficult to name. I was being managed by assumption, assumed to adapt, assumed to agree, assumed to stay. And for a long time, I did. What I didn't understand yet was that roles like this don't stay static. They either expand into influence or they shrink into replaceability. And once a system decides which direction you're headed, It rarely announces the decision. I was still doing excellent work. I was still trusted, within limits. But the boundaries of my role were becoming more rigid, more invisible, more taken for granted. And then, quietly, without confrontation or warning, something inside me shifted. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no performance review gone wrong, no dramatic email that changed everything. In fact, if you'd asked anyone else what happened that day, they probably wouldn't remember it at all. I remember it clearly. It was late afternoon, the kind of quiet hour when most people had mentally checked out but stayed at their desks out of habit. I was reviewing a set of documents, work I had already done once, now reframed and redistributed under a different name. This wasn't new. I'd seen it before. But this time, something in me didn't rush to explain it away. I just stopped, not working, thinking. I noticed how tired I felt, but not in the way that comes from being busy. It was a deeper fatigue, the kind that comes from constantly adjusting yourself to fit expectations you didn't set. I realized that I had become fluent in translating other people's urgency into my responsibility. And that fluency had come at a cost. For the first time, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. I saw the pattern without immediately defending it. I saw how often I had been the last to know and the first to fix. How my silence had been interpreted as consent. How my reliability had become a substitute for respect. And I realized something else, something quieter, but more unsettling. No one was going to interrupt this pattern for me, not because they were cruel, but because the system was working for them. My discomfort wasn't visible enough to register as a problem. My professionalism had made sure of that. That realization didn't hurt. It steadied me. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't draft a message or rehearse a speech. I didn't even change my expression. I finished my work, closed my laptop, and went home. But internally, a line had been crossed. For the first time, I stopped asking myself how to be easier to work with. I stopped wondering how to phrase things so they would land gently. Instead, I asked a different question. What am I protecting by staying quiet? And who benefits from it? The answer was uncomfortable. I was protecting an image. The image of being agreeable, competent, and indispensable. And that image benefited everyone except me. That night, I opened my leather-bound journal, the one I'd been using for years to track tasks and ideas. And I wrote something I hadn't allowed myself to write before. Not accusations, not grievances, just observations, patterns, moments that had felt off but had been smoothed over. Seeing them together changed their weight. What had felt like isolated incidents now looked like a structure, a system that leaned on me without including me, a role that depended on my silence to function. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt misaligned, as if I had been walking in a direction that no longer matched who I was becoming. The shift wasn't about anger. It was about ownership. I realized that silence didn't have to mean endurance. It could mean choice. And choice, once recognized, can't be unrecognized. The next morning, nothing was different. I showed up on time. I responded to messages. I participated as expected. But internally, I was no longer trying to prove my value. I was observing where it was already assumed and where it wasn't. That change was subtle, but it altered everything. I began to notice how often decisions were made without context, how often urgency was manufactured, how often my flexibility was used to cover poor planning. I didn't intervene immediately. I didn't need to. Awareness itself was enough to create distance. Distance creates options. I wasn't plotting an exit. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was simply no longer invested in maintaining a dynamic that required my self erasure. The shift was quiet, but it was irreversible. Once you see the role you're playing clearly, you can't unsee it. And once you stop confusing tolerance with professionalism, you begin to understand how much power you've been giving away. That day didn't change my situation, it changed my posture within it. And from that point on, silence was no longer something that happened to me. It became something I chose. When silence becomes a choice, it changes its texture. Before, my quiet had been reactive. I stayed silent to avoid conflict, to preserve stability, to keep things moving. After that internal shift, silence became deliberate, observational, strategic, not in a calculating sense, but in a self respecting one. I stopped filling every gap. When questions were asked vaguely, I didn't rush to interpret them. When timelines were unrealistic, I didn't immediately offer workarounds. I still did my job well, but I stopped compensating for decisions I hadn't been part of. This wasn't obvious to anyone else. That's the thing about boundaries when you've never had them. The first ones you set are invisible. They feel internal, subtle, almost imaginary. But systems notice even small changes. Meetings started running longer without my interventions. A few projects stalled briefly, not catastrophically, just enough to reveal how much I'd been smoothing over. I didn't point it out. I didn't claim responsibility. I let the friction exist. Others mistook my quiet for disengagement. I heard it in the tone of the comments. Grace has been a bit quieter lately. She seems busy. She'll let us know if there's an issue. The assumption remained the same. If something mattered, I would speak up. If I weren't speaking, everything would be fine. That assumption gave me space. I began listening differently. Instead of preparing responses, I paid attention to how decisions were framed. Who was consulted? Who wasn't? Which voices were amplified and which were treated as logistical support? I also began documenting, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. I wrote down when decisions were made without me, when responsibilities shifted without notice, when my work was referenced without attribution, not emotionally, just factually. Dates, context, outcomes. This wasn't about building a case. It was about grounding my perception in reality. Because one of the most destabilizing things about quiet marginalization is how easily it makes you doubt yourself. Documentation restored clarity. It reminded me that what I was experiencing wasn't imaginary, it was patterned. At the same time, I became more selective with my energy. I stopped volunteering for initiatives that didn't align with my role or growth. I declined meetings where my presence was symbolic rather than functional. When asked why, I gave simple, neutral explanations. Capacity, priorities, scope. No one challenged me. That surprised me. It turns out that when you've been overfunctioning for a long time, people don't know where the baseline actually is. They assume any reduction is temporary. They assume you'll return to form. I let them assume. What they didn't realize was that I was learning. Not in a formal sense, no courses, no certifications yet, but in awareness. I was learning how the organization really worked, where power sat, how narratives were shaped, how decisions were justified after the fact. I noticed how often urgency was used to bypass consultation, how alignment was invoked only after direction had already been set, how certain people were always in the room when it mattered, and others, like me, were looped in afterward to execute. This knowledge didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Silence, chosen consciously, gave me time. Time to observe without reacting. Time to understand the rules I'd been playing by without ever reading. And perhaps, most importantly, Time to detach my sense of worth from immediate approval. When you stop seeking validation from a system that benefits from your compliance, you regain a surprising amount of internal freedom. I no longer needed to be seen as easy. I needed to be aligned with myself. From the outside, I looked the same. Same demeanor, same professionalism, same output, within reason. But internally, I had shifted from participant to observer. Others interpreted my calm as weakness, or complacency, or fatigue. They were wrong. I wasn't retreating. I was repositioning. And while they assumed nothing had changed, I was beginning to notice something else, something critical that they never had. There were things happening around me that no one was paying attention to. Gaps, dependencies, knowledge silos, risks that were invisible because I'd always absorbed them. And once I stopped absorbing them automatically, they became visible. That's when preparation began. Preparation rarely looks like preparation when it's done quietly. From the outside, nothing about my behavior suggested change. I wasn't scheduling secret meetings. I wasn't networking aggressively or updating my resume in obvious ways. I wasn't signaling dissatisfaction. If anything, I appeared calmer, more contained, less reactive. That calm gave me cover. What they never noticed was how much of the system lived in my head. Over the years, I had accumulated knowledge that didn't belong to any one document or dashboard. I knew why certain processes existed, not just how they worked. I knew which shortcuts were safe because I tested them under pressure. I knew which dependencies were fragile, which vendors were unreliable, and which timelines were aspirational rather than realistic. This knowledge hadn't been formalized because it didn't need to be. As long as I was there, I began mapping it, not in a dramatic way, just quietly organizing what I already knew. I reviewed old project notes, cross-referenced decisions with outcomes, not to assign blame, but to understand causality, where things broke when I stepped back, where assumptions had replaced verification. I also noticed something else. How often I had been acting as a buffer. When leadership made aggressive commitments, I softened them before they reached the team. When teams raised concerns, I translated them into palatable summaries. I had been smoothing communication in both directions, reducing friction at my own expense. Once I stopped doing that reflexively, small cracks appeared. Nothing catastrophic, just confusion, follow-up questions, misaligned expectations. The kinds of issues that get labeled as growing pains when no one realizes their symptoms. No one connected them to me. They couldn't, because they'd never fully seen what I was holding together. I also began paying attention to documentation, or the lack of it. How much institutional memory lives informally? How many decisions were justified verbally but never recorded? How often we agreed really meant someone decided and moved on. I didn't rush to correct this. I let it be visible. At the same time, I started having different kinds of conversations. Not confrontational ones, curious ones. I asked how certain decisions had been made, what assumptions were driving them, who had signed off. Sometimes people answered confidently. Sometimes they deflected. Sometimes they realized, mid-sentence, that they didn't actually know. Those moments told me more than any spreadsheet ever could. I learned where authority was concentrated and where it was performative. I learned who had real decision-making power and who was repeating talking points. I learned how narratives were shaped after outcomes were already locked in. Most importantly, I learned how replaceability was being calculated. Because while I had believed my deep knowledge made me indispensable, the system didn't operate on gratitude. It operated on abstraction. As long as my work could be summarized, reframed, or redistributed on paper, my presence was optional. That realization didn't scare me. It sharpened me. I began preparing not to defend my position, but to reclaim my agency. I updated my own records, clarified ownership where it existed, not aggressively, just accurately. I stopped taking on work without a clear scope. I asked for decisions in writing, not as a challenge, but as a preference. Some people adjusted, some didn't. What they never noticed was that I was no longer investing in being irreplaceable inside their system. I was investing in understanding it well enough to step outside it on my own terms. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over your own next move. And my next move was forming slowly, deliberately, without urgency. I also paid attention to how my absence might be interpreted. Not emotionally, but operationally. What would happen if I weren't in the room? Who would notice? How long would it take for gaps to surface? I didn't test this recklessly. I observed natural variations, vacations, conflicting priorities, moments when I was less available than usual. The results were consistent. Things didn't collapse, but they didn't flow either. And that distinction mattered because it meant my value wasn't visible in outcomes. It was visible in smoothness. And smoothness, when taken for granted, is often mistaken for ease. They assumed ease was inherent. It wasn't. By the time I finished this phase of preparation, I wasn't angry. I wasn't resentful. I was informed, grounded, clear. I knew what I contributed. I knew how it was perceived. And I knew what would happen if I stopped compensating. What they never noticed was that while they were busy optimizing around me, I was quietly positioning myself beyond them. And soon, that awareness would crystallize into something undeniable. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no email that changed everything, no whispered confirmation, no sudden discovery that flipped the table. What happened instead was quieter and far more decisive. It came together slowly, the way truth often does when you finally stop rushing past it. I was reviewing documentation late one evening, not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand something that had been bothering me for weeks. A decision had been made that contradicted previous guidance, subtly but meaningfully. It had been framed as alignment, but the logic didn't hold. So I traced it back. Meeting notes, approval threads, version histories. What I found wasn't malicious. That would have been easier to process. What I found was carelessness layered on top of assumption. Decisions made without full context. Responsibilities shifted without clear ownership. And most importantly, a quiet dependence on my presence to resolve contradictions after the fact. The system wasn't designed to function cleanly without me. It was designed to appear functional because I was compensating. That was the reveal, not that I was indispensable, but that I was being used as a stabilizer for instability no one wanted to acknowledge. And because that stabilization happened quietly, it wasn't valued. It was expected. I sat with that realization for a long time. There was no surge of vindication, no sense of triumph, just clarity. A clean, emotionless understanding of how things actually worked and how they would likely proceed. I also saw something else, something more personal. I had been telling myself that staying was a form of integrity, that leaving, or even pushing back, would disrupt people who relied on me. But what I was really doing was protecting a system that had no incentive to protect me in return. That wasn't loyalty, it was inertia. The private reveal wasn't about leverage in the traditional sense. I didn't uncover a secret or a scandal. What I uncovered was structural truth. The kind that doesn't need to be exposed publicly to be powerful. I realized that my leverage wasn't in confrontation. It was a choice. I could continue absorbing risk and smoothing outcomes, and the system would continue exactly as it was. Or I could stop, and let the system encounter itself. Either way, I would be fine. That was new. Up until then, I'd unconsciously believed that my well being was tied to their approval. My stability depended on maintaining my role. That stepping away, even partially, would create chaos I'd feel responsible for. But seeing the structure clearly broke that illusion. The chaos wasn't mine. I'd just been containing it. That night, I didn't make a plan. I didn't decide to leave or stay. I didn't draft a resignation letter or imagine a confrontation. I simply acknowledged the truth and let it settle. And once it settled, it changed how everything felt. The next day, I moved through my work with a different kind of calm. Not the calm of endurance, but the calm of someone who knows they have options. I responded thoughtfully. I asked clarifying questions. I didn't rush to resolve ambiguity unless it was explicitly mine to resolve. No one noticed the shift. They couldn't. From their perspective, things were still working. And as long as things work, systems don't interrogate why. But internally, something had crystallized. I no longer felt obligated to preserve a dynamic that depended on my self-erasure. I no longer felt guilty imagining a future that didn't include compensating for others' blind spots. The reveal wasn't a weapon, it was a release. I understood that whatever happened next wouldn't be reactive. It would be chosen, measured, irreversible in its own quiet way. Because once you see where your power actually lives, you stop wasting it trying to be seen. You start using it to decide where you belong. And that realization led me to the only question that mattered next. One I couldn't avoid much longer. What was I going to do with this clarity? Clarity doesn't demand action immediately. That's a mistake people often make, believing that once you see the truth, you're obligated to move fast. I wasn't. I let the clarity sit. I let it test itself against reality. But eventually, clarity asks a question you can't postpone forever. What are you going to do with it? I reached a point where every option was visible to me. Staying, leaving, confronting, recalibrating, none of them were abstract anymore. Each had a weight. Each had consequences. And for the first time, I wasn't choosing from fear. If I stayed exactly as I was, nothing would explode. That was the danger. The system would continue to function, just unevenly. I would continue to be relied on without being respected. The work would get done. My name would remain quietly attached to execution, not direction. Staying meant safety without growth. If I confronted the situation directly, named the patterns, requested change, I might be heard, or I might be labeled. Even if the conversation went well, it would require others to acknowledge a dynamic they benefited from. Systems resist that. They apologize, promise adjustment, and slowly revert. Confrontation would cost energy with no guarantee of structural change. If I left abruptly, I would regain autonomy quickly, but at the expense of coherence. Loose ends would remain. Narratives would be written without me. My departure would be framed as a surprise, not a response. That didn't sit right with me. I wasn't angry enough to burn bridges. I was clear enough not to vanish. The final option was quieter and irreversible. I could stop positioning myself as part of the future they were planning, not through announcement, not through threat, but through alignment. I could choose myself without demanding recognition for it. That meant accepting something uncomfortable. Once I stepped out of the role I'd been assigned, I would no longer be protected by it. There would be no praise for loyalty, no reassurance. No one would rush to understand my perspective. And I was ready for that. The decision point wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with adrenaline. It came with a strange sense of relief. I decided to move forward without asking permission, not recklessly, not emotionally, strategically, calmly, and in a way that didn't require anyone else to agree. I began preparing my exit, not from the company immediately, but from the dynamic. I stopped tying my identity to the team's stability. I stopped measuring my value by how indispensable I felt. I stopped optimizing for approval. This decision changed how I allocated my time, my attention, and my effort. I focused on work that had clear ownership and clear impact. I deprioritized tasks that existed solely to buffer poor decisions. I asked for clarity where ambiguity had previously been convenient. I didn't announce this shift. I let it speak for itself. What made the decision irreversible wasn't a document or a deadline. It was internal alignment. Once I stopped seeing myself as responsible for holding everything together, I couldn't go back to pretending I was. And that's the thing about true decision points. They don't always change the world immediately, but they permanently change how you move through it. I knew that once I crossed this line, there would be consequences. Not punishment, but exposure. The system would eventually feel the absence of my compensation. The smoothness would erode. Questions would surface. I was prepared for that because I had already accepted the cost of staying. Choosing the irreversible path doesn't mean choosing drama. It means choosing coherence. It means deciding that your internal reality will no longer be shaped by external convenience. I didn't need anyone to understand my choice. I just needed to honor it. And from that moment on, everything I did was informed by one quiet principle. I would no longer make myself small to keep something broken running. The movement that followed wasn't loud. It wasn't visible, but it was already in motion. Once the decision was made, there was no need to announce it. Movement, when it's intentional, doesn't require witnesses. I didn't change my tone. I didn't withdraw socially. I didn't hint at dissatisfaction or float vague comments about next steps. From the outside, I was still doing my job, calmly, competently, professionally. But underneath that surface, everything was different. I began by tightening boundaries that had always been loose. Not defensively, precisely. I asked for written confirmation when responsibilities shifted. I clarified ownership before accepting new work. I stopped stepping in automatically when something wasn't mine to resolve. These were small actions, almost invisible. But together, they changed the rhythm of how work moved through me. I also reviewed my agreements, formal and informal. What was I actually responsible for? What had I simply absorbed over time? The difference mattered more than I'd ever allowed myself to admit. I started honoring the letter of my role instead of the emotional expectations attached to it. This wasn't a rebellion. It was alignment. At the same time, I took care of things quietly, off to the side. I reviewed my financial position, not urgently, methodically. I made sure I understood my runway, my options, and my flexibility. I didn't need certainty. I needed readiness. I also began documenting transitions more carefully, not as a warning, as a habit. When I completed work, I summarized it clearly. When decisions were made, I confirmed them in writing. When something fell outside my scope, I said so neutrally. No one objected. That told me everything I needed to know. Silence, when chosen, has a way of revealing how much of a system relies on assumption. When you stop filling in gaps automatically, people have to confront what they've been leaning on. They don't always like it, but they rarely name it. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was making myself legible. What I didn't realize at the time was how destabilizing that would eventually become. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because clarity removes plausible deniability. As I moved more cleanly, others began to feel the weight of their own decisions more directly. Follow-ups increased, timelines slipped, questions surfaced that I'd previously resolved quietly before they ever reached daylight. Still, no one connected this to me. They assumed the environment had changed, or that complexity had increased, or that people were just tired. The idea that the system had been cushioned by one person wasn't visible enough to register. And I didn't correct that assumption. Moving in silence meant letting outcomes speak without narration. There was a strange peace in this phase. I wasn't bracing myself anymore. I wasn't scanning for approval or preparing explanations. I was simply doing what was mine to do, and nothing more. That restraint conserved energy I hadn't realized I'd been spending. I also noticed how differently people interacted with me when I stopped overfunctioning. Some became more formal. Some are more cautious. A few became more distant. But none of them asked what had changed. They didn't need to. On some level, systems sense when someone has stopped being available in the same way. They respond not with curiosity, but with adjustment. What I didn't know yet was that while I was moving quietly, decisions were being made elsewhere about me. Decisions framed as efficiency, as restructuring, as alignment with future priorities. I wasn't in the room for those conversations, and that was fine, because by the time they began shaping a future that no longer included me, I had already begun shaping one that didn't depend on them. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about sovereignty. It's about acting from clarity instead of reaction. I wasn't hiding my intentions. I simply wasn't offering them up for discussion. And soon, the consequences of that quiet movement would begin to surface. First subtly, then unmistakably. The consequences didn't arrive with an announcement. They never do. At first, they showed up as confused. A meeting that ran longer than planned. A deliverable that came back with questions instead of approval. A timeline that slipped by a few days because dependencies hadn't been clarified early enough. None of this was dramatic. None of it triggered alarms. But it was different. People began to feel friction where there hadn't been any before. I noticed it in the way messages were written. Slightly more careful, slightly more detailed. In the way questions were framed, less assumptive, more tentative. In the pauses during meetings, when someone expected an answer that didn't immediately come. Those pauses used to be filled by me. I didn't step in to rescue them, not out of spite, out of alignment. When someone finally asked, "Do we know who owns this?" I answered honestly. If it wasn't me, I said so. If the decision hadn't been made, I didn't infer one. I didn't smooth. I didn't translate. I let the question sit where it belonged. At first, people assumed this was temporary. They treated the friction like a glitch, something that would resolve once things settled down. They adjusted schedules, added check-ins, and increased oversight. But the more they tried to manage around the friction, the clearer it became that something fundamental had shifted. What they were feeling wasn't a slowdown, it was exposure. The system had been relying on invisible labor to stay efficient. And once that labor stopped compensating, the inefficiencies surfaced, not as failures, but as unanswered questions, duplicated effort, and misaligned expectations. Still, no one named the source. Instead, there was a growing sense of unease, a subtle awareness that things didn't move the way they used to, and no one was quite sure why. I was still there, still present, still professional. That made it harder to attribute the change to me. From their perspective, I hadn't left. I hadn't complained. I hadn't withdrawn. I had simply stopped absorbing. People began looping me into conversations again, not out of recognition, but out of necessity. Just to get your take, they'd say, to sanity check, or to make sure we're aligned. I listened. I answered when it made sense. But I no longer took ownership by default. And that's when something interesting happened. The consequences didn't just affect processes. They affected Perceptions, decisions that had once felt confident, began to feel rushed. Commitments that had been made casually now carried visible risk. People started double checking things they'd previously waved through. There was no blame, just discomfort. I could feel it in the room when discussions stalled, and someone realized, mid sentence, that they didn't actually know the answer. When eyes flicked briefly in my direction, not for rescue, but for confirmation that I wasn't going to provide it. I didn't enjoy these moments. I wasn't savoring them. I was observing, because observation without intervention reveals truth. What became clear was that the system didn't miss me. It missed the version of me that made everything easier without asking anything in return. And that version was gone. Still, the consequences were manageable. For now. No one was panicking. No one was escalating. The organization adjusted in small ways, attributing the changes to growth, complexity, or shifting priorities. That's how systems protect themselves from acknowledging dependency. But pressure has a way of accumulating quietly. And once it reaches a certain point, it looks for a release. I didn't know exactly when that release would come. I just knew it would. Because when invisible labor stops being invisible, it doesn't announce itself. It simply leaves a shape behind. And eventually, someone asks why that shape is there. The moment they realized something was wrong came much later than the moment it became unfixable. That's the quiet irony of systems built on assumption. They don't notice strain until it hardens into consequence. At first, the questions were procedural. Then they became directional. Meetings multiplied. Language shifted. I began hearing phrases like, "We need to tighten this up," and "We should have caught this earlier." There was no accusation, just a growing sense of urgency that hadn't existed before. What changed wasn't the workload, it was the margin for error. Without my constant buffering, decisions began colliding with reality more directly. Commitments met constraints, optimism met logistics. And suddenly, the smooth narrative of efficiency required more explanation than anyone expected. That's when the reaching out began. Not formally, casually. A message here, a quick call there. "Can you remind me why we did it this way? Do you remember how this usually gets handled? What's your take on how we should proceed?" I answered honestly, but narrowly. I shared what I knew without taking ownership. I explained the context without solving outcomes. I gave information, not absolution. Some people sensed the difference immediately, others didn't. They kept asking questions that assumed I would eventually step back into the role I'd always played, the one who connected dots, resolved tension, and made it all work. I didn't, not because I couldn't, because I wouldn't. And that's when the panic crept in. Not loudly, but unmistakably. Deadlines slipped far enough to be noticed. Decisions had to be revisited. Stakeholders began asking why things that used to be simple now required so much discussion. The answers were vague. The explanations are incomplete. No one said my name. They didn't have to. What they were feeling was the absence of a pattern they'd relied on without ever naming. And once that pattern broke, it couldn't be restored quickly because it had never been formalized in the first place. Someone suggested documenting processes more thoroughly. Someone else proposed reassigning ownership. There were talks of restructuring, not out of malice, but out of confusion. These fixes came too late because they weren't addressing the real issue. They were reacting to symptoms, not the cause. I watched this unfold with a strange mix of detachment and empathy. I understood why they were scrambling. I had been the one preventing the scramble for years. But I also knew that stepping back in would only reset the cycle. They didn't need another patch. They needed reckoning. Eventually, someone asked the question that had been circling for weeks. Do we know exactly what Grace is responsible for? The fact that this was even a question told me everything. After years of contribution, my role had been felt more than it had been defined. And now, in trying to define it retroactively, they were discovering how much had been built around my silence. There were attempts to re engage me more fully, invitations framed as inclusion, conversations framed as appreciation. But the language was still vague. The structure is still intact. Nothing fundamental had changed. By then, it was too late. Not because I was leaving immediately, but because the trust that allowed me to overfunction without resentment was gone. And trust, once replaced by clarity, doesn't return to its previous form. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I simply wasn't available in the way they needed anymore. They were trying to fix a dynamic that had already revealed itself. And systems can adjust processes quickly, but they can't undo awareness. The realization that something essential had been taken for granted arrived slowly and then all at once. Not as an admission, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the old way no longer worked. And when a system realizes that, it looks for a resolution. Sometimes that resolution is reconciliation. Sometimes it's separation. In this case, the decision would be made without ceremony. And I would learn about it the same way I'd learned so much else. Indirectly. I didn't find out through a conversation. There was no meeting on my calendar. No quiet request to talk. No acknowledgement that a decision affecting my role, even my presence, had been made. I found out I'd been removed from the team through the company newsletter. It arrived like any other internal update. New initiatives, shifting priorities, a brief paragraph about restructuring. My name wasn't mentioned, not as a departure, not as a transition. It was simply absent from a list it had always been part of. Courtesy wasn't part of the process. I remember staring at the screen longer than necessary. Not because I was shocked, but because I was registering how little emotion I felt. No spike of anger, no rush of embarrassment. Just a quiet confirmation of something I already knew. They had chosen efficiency over conversation, and in doing so, they had revealed the full shape of the dynamic I'd stepped out of. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't forward the newsletter or ask for clarification. I finished the task I was working on, closed my laptop, and took a breath that felt deeper than usual. Later that day, someone did reach out. A short message, careful wording. Hey, just wanted to check in. Do you have a few minutes? We met in a small conference room. Neutral space, neutral tone. There was no apology. There rarely is in moments like this. The only explanation. Alignment. Forward-looking language. The decision was framed as structural, not personal. Necessary. Clean. I listened. Not because I needed to understand, but because I wanted to hear how it would be justified. What struck me wasn't what was said. It was what wasn't. No mention of how the decision had been communicated. No acknowledgement that I hadn't been informed directly. No recognition of the years I'd spent stabilizing the very systems now being streamlined. So when it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't challenge the logic. I didn't ask for reconsideration. I said one thing. I understand the decision. I just want to note that finding out through the newsletter wasn't ideal. The room went quiet. Not tense, just surprised. There was a brief attempt to explain. Timing. Oversight. No harm intended. I nodded. Not in agreement, in closure. I didn't need an apology to move on. I needed clarity, and I already had it. That conversation didn't change the outcome. It wasn't meant to. It changed the tone. For the first time, I wasn't the one smoothing discomfort. I let it exist. I didn't absorb it. I didn't make it easier for them to feel good about how things had been handled. That was the confrontation. Calm, minimal, complete. We discussed logistics, transition timelines, what I would and wouldn't be responsible for moving forward. I was clear. Boundaries were respected, not because they'd suddenly learned, but because there was no ambiguity left to exploit. When the meeting ended, I didn't feel diminished. I felt finished, not discarded, released. Because the truth was, I'd already left the role long before it was officially reassigned. The newsletter hadn't removed me. It had simply confirmed that the system no longer knew what to do with someone who wouldn't disappear quietly inside it. There was no final speech. No emotional resolution was offered by them. I didn't need one. The confrontation didn't happen in raised voices or accusations. It happened in a restraint, in naming a single omission, in refusing to carry the discomfort that belonged elsewhere. And that was enough. When people ask me now how I feel about what happened, I pause. Not because the question is difficult, but because the answer is quieter than they expect. I don't feel wronged. I don't feel victorious. I don't even feel particularly changed in the way people usually mean when they talk about transformation. I feel clarified. Losing a role you've already outgrown doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like alignment catching up with reality. In the months after that newsletter, my life didn't explode into freedom or collapse into uncertainty. It reorganized, gradually, intentionally. I took time, not to recover, but to recalibrate, to notice how much of my identity had been shaped around being useful to a system that didn't know how to see me. Without that system, there was space, not empty space, honest space. I became more deliberate about where I placed my effort, more selective about what I took responsibility for, more aware of how easily professionalism can slide into self-erasure if you're not paying attention. I didn't become louder. I didn't adopt a sharper edge. I didn't rewrite myself to fit a different archetype. I remained calm, observant, composed. But I stopped mistaking endurance for virtue. I stopped equating silence with maturity. I stopped assuming that being overlooked was the cost of being ethical. And I stopped believing that stability had to come at the expense of presence. What changed most wasn't my circumstances. It was my posture. I no longer wait for systems to recognize my value. I assess whether they're capable of holding it. I no longer overinvest in environments that reward invisibility. I ask clearer questions earlier. I listen to my own hesitation instead of explaining it away. And when something feels off, I don't rush to normalize it. That alone has changed everything. I'd work differently now, with clearer boundaries, with defined ownership, with an understanding that contribution without agency is not collaboration, it's extraction. I still believe in teamwork. I still value calm. I still choose professionalism. But I no longer offer them as substitutes for self-respect. The experience didn't make me cynical. It made me precise. I don't tell the story to warn people away from commitment or loyalty. I tell it to name a pattern that thrives on good intentions and quiet competence. Because people like me, people who carry things without complaint, often don't realize how much they're holding until they put it down. And when they do, the world doesn't collapse. It adjusts. Who I am now is not someone hardened by disappointment. I'm someone refined by clarity. I know the difference between being needed and being valued. I know the cost of silence and the power of choosing it intentionally. I'm no longer interested in proving myself through endurance. I'm interested in alignment. And that alignment didn't come from confrontation or revenge or dramatic exits. It came from noticing, from stopping, from choosing not to disappear. If there's one thing this experience gave me, it's a deep respect for the quiet moment when you decide, without spectacle, that you will no longer play a role that requires you to be less than whole. There's a particular kind of lesson that doesn't arrive as advice. It arrives as recognition. This story isn't about a bad company or a cruel decision. It's about what happens when quiet competence is mistaken for infinite capacity, and when courtesy is treated as optional because someone is unlikely to protest. I wasn't removed from a team because I failed. I was removed because the role I'd been filling no longer fit the narrative they needed to move forward. And that role existed largely because I had agreed, silently, to play it. That's the part that matters. Systems don't usually exploit people intentionally. They do it gradually, through convenience, through assumptions, through the unspoken belief that the person who doesn't complain must be fine. And if you're someone who prides yourself on professionalism, on composure, on being easy to work with, it's very easy to become invisible inside that logic. The moral here isn't that you should speak louder or demand more. It's that you should listen earlier to your own discomfort, to the small moments that don't sit right, to the quiet signals that something is being taken for granted. Courtesy isn't about politeness, it's about acknowledgement. It's about recognizing that people aren't interchangeable parts in a process, even when they're capable of making everything run smoothly. When courtesy disappears, clarity eventually follows. Not always in your favor, not always gently, but inevitably. What I learned is that silence isn't a flaw, but it becomes one when it's used against you. Chosen silence is power. Inherited silence is erosion. Knowing the difference can save you years of self-doubt. I don't regret staying as long as I did. It taught me how systems really work and how easily they forget the people who hold them together. But I also don't regret stepping away, even in the quiet way that I did. Because leaving a dynamic that requires you to shrink isn't failure, it's integrity. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever found yourself doing more, saying less, and wondering why it never quite balances out, I hope this story gives you permission to pause, not to react, not to confront, just to notice. Notice where your effort goes unacknowledged. Notice where your silence is assumed. Notice where courtesy has quietly been removed from the process. And then decide, on your own terms, what you're willing to continue carrying. I'll end with one question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that your silence was being used as consent? And what did you choose to do when you finally saw it?